Throughout most of high school and my childhood, I had always been mostly indifferent. I only recently began to decide on what I wanted, liked, and needed. I still am indifferent about a lot of things, but I value some aspects of my life enough to have my own feelings about them. There were a lot of factors that contributed to my indifference. It began when I abandoned any value I had in sentiment. My dad had always been a practical person, and he was my role model throughout a lot of my life. I'm not trying to blame him for the struggle I went through, it truly had nothing to do with him. A lot of it was my own fault and my own decision making. Anyway, I adopted my dad's practicality, however I did so on a drastic level. I slowly lowered the number of belongings I had, getting rid of anything that I had not used for an extended period, despite whatever memory or sentiment was attached to it. My practicality slowly led to my detachment from my own humanity, something I ironically claimed to value highly. As time progressed, I started to become somewhat emotionless and stagnant. My indifference, in combination with my quickly sprouting cynicism, led me to see expressing emotions as, well, pointless. From then until later in high school, I became completely unable to cry. Crying and expressing emotions seemed pointless to me because there was no practical value. I thought I'd become what I strived to be, indifferent. But being indifferent to everything was not healthy. Unfortunately, it took far too long for me to come to that realization. My own nephew, who was only a few months old, passed away and I did not shed a single tear. Several other family members and people I knew passed away or experienced horrific things, but I physically couldn't cry. I wanted to cry, but I had turned myself into an empty shell and I had lost the capability to express deeper emotions. My incapability to express emotions was not the only effect my indifference had on me. In combination with my indifference and some experiences I had in high school, I found myself unable to become attached to people. At first I thought I simply wasn't interested in dating at all, but then I found my struggle for interpersonal attachment seeping into my friendships too. It became hard for me to upkeep my friendships and stay close with some groups of people simply because I no longer cared for the sentiment involved with interpersonal relationships. My friends did not notice this, or maybe they did. Even so, they all stuck with me until I graduated and are still my good friends to this day. To wrap up my story, I eventually reconnected with my church through my parents, and although I was still hesitant on many of the church's practices and beliefs due to my cynicism, I joined the youth group to meet new people. I was given the opportunity to attend the National Catholic Youth Conference through my youth group. Not getting into any specifics, I had a moment at NCYC where I actually cried. It was the first time I had cried, excluding from physical pain, in years. Afterward, despite the confusing mix of emotions I was experiencing, I felt relieved that I had cried. Something about letting my emotions spill into tears was relieving, and after that moment I decided to try and push myself to rebuild my empathy and humanitarianism from the ground up. Bloom Into You was one of the many catalysts for me to come to that decision. Yagata Kimi Naru, or Bloom Into You, is not just a normal love story. Sure, it is a Yuri anime, and it seems to be a requirement that Yuri has some kind of kinkiness to it, episode 9. But Bloom Into You includes far more adventurous themes than meets the eye. It isn't just a story about homosexuality, it's a story about asexuality and, to an extension, extreme indifference. You had always thought that receiving a confession would be a magical experience as the media portrayed it to be. When she is confessed to, however, she finds herself to be shockingly indifferent. Sayaka, at her core, is timid, curious, and ignorant, but she puts up a front to always be indifferent. Maki always spends his time watching romances unfold around him rather than participating, and the root of his asexuality is his indifference. I had to watch the series 3 whole times before I discovered why I enjoyed it so much. First of all, it made me feel something. It made me feel and express empathy for the characters. I also heavily related to the varying burden of indifference that Yu, Sayaka, and Maki carried, and I fell in love with them for that reason. Yu wanted to feel love for Toko, and she eventually does. She was a representation of hope for me, that one day I too could value sentiment. Sayaka's true self rarely shines through her mask of indifference, which allowed me to discover my true self buried deep beneath my own indifference. Maki is asexual and does not desire romantic interpersonal relationships, which showed me that it was okay for me to have friendships and family relationships without worrying about valuing romance. Bloom Into You is not a masterpiece by any means, but I highly suggest you give it a watch if you haven't already. It truly was a profound experience for me to go through during my struggles, and I hope you can relate to these wonderful characters as much as I did. My journey through overcoming my extreme indifference and cynicism was encouraged by many different pieces of media. not just bloom into you, and it was also encouraged by many different people who will go unnamed in this video, but whose impacts will live with me forever. I do not have disdain for my extreme indifference that shaped most of my life, because it has led to several good things. When I decided to change and become more self-conscious of my personality, I was more easily able to decide what I was feeling and what I wanted. In turn, I connected with several groups of people who share my journey and who I am still close with today. My desire to escape my indifference has also culminated into my wit and sarcastic personality that my friends and family know me for. I truly love the way I am now, but I would never change the way who I was. At my core, I am an introvert. I may at times appear to be an extrovert, but I'm really not one. In reality, I force myself to be an extrovert in certain situations. I made a video on my journey through extreme indifference, and I recommend you give it a watch for the context of this video, though you don't have to. In essence, I lived through a lot of my life with indifference, and I only recently overcame most of it. There were other things involved with my indifference, such as a lack of empathy, a lack of emotions, lack of sentiment, and a lack of a desire to establish interpersonal relationships. I can't say I've entirely overcome them all, but when I did, for the most part, crawl out of the hole I was stuck in for most of my life, I felt behind. I lost so much time on building relationships, and I felt as though I needed to catch up somehow. Due to this, I forced myself to become more extroverted around people I didn't know. I had to learn a lot of things before I could do this, however. I had to learn what social cues were and how to follow them, first of all. One large difference between extroverts and introverts is that social cues tend to come subconsciously to extroverts. True extroverts don't always have to think about what to do and what not to do depending on the context of the social situation. As an introvert, I had to learn these social cues and rules, which was difficult enough on its own, but I also had to apply them in social situations. Even now, I still have to consciously think of every social cue during even simple conversations and small talk. I'm constantly thinking of even simple stuff such as maintaining eye contact, my hand gestures, and what not to say in the context, regardless of the conversation I'm having. Consequently, I find social interaction, regardless of who it is with, exhausting. I love spending time with my friends just as much as anyone else does, but it's still tiring for me to be constantly conscious of social cues and rules. Unlike harem protagonists, I do not have the density of a neutron star. I may act dense for convenience, but I am usually aware of the implications behind what people say, how they say it, and how they act during an interaction. I've recently started college and have found myself attempting to introduce myself to new people all the time. Luckily, my roommate is my introverted high school friend, so I haven't had to worry about that. Anyway, in a lot of group conversations, I found myself lacking presence. I've realized that this wasn't an issue I've only had here at college. Throughout all of my life, I've experienced scenarios where I lack presence. In Yuru Yuri, one of the running jokes is that Akarin lacks presence despite her protagonistic appearance. I don't believe that this is an issue unique to just a select few people. We've all likely experienced a situation where we felt out of place or where people simply don't acknowledge our existence. As I described earlier, I have definitely had my fair share of those experiences. Akarin isn't a representation of a specific situation for a very narrow group of people to identify with. Anyone can identify with her situation. The truth is, mine, yours, everyone's presence is scarce. It's a scarce resource, and naturally it's also a resource that we all need and want. Social circles and groups are, well, a battlefield where everyone is fighting over their already scarce presence, desperately clinging to the little presence they have while also craving more. As humans, it's natural that we all want to be acknowledged, but just like any battlefield, there are those who are left with less. That's just how it is. This cruel battlefield, specifically when those involved are strangers, supports those who are more extroverted, which forces introverts such as me to be extroverted, even if it is only an act. That is partly the reason that introverts stick to small groups of people that they are close with, rather than broadening their network of friends. In episode 11 of Yuru Yuri Season 2, we see a new perspective on Akarin's presence. She gets trapped in the past when she accidentally uses a time machine, leaving everything behind in the present. She decides to use it as an opportunity to fix her past mistakes, but then she soon realizes that fixing those mistakes would change everything, and that she greatly misses all of her friends. She makes a determined effort to return to her present time, and eventually she finds a way to get back. On her way back, she reflects on all of her friendships and believes that they wouldn't even realize she was gone because of her lack of presence. However, when she does return home, to her surprise, she finds all of her friends creating missing person signs to hang up around the school and town. This episode portrays a specific theme, and that is that regardless of how little presence you have in any social situation or group of people, someone will always acknowledge you. There's always someone out there who knows of your presence and who will never forget it. Sure, your presence is scarce, but you know what? That's okay. Even if you think that all is lost and no one has or ever will acknowledge your presence, I want you to know that I do. Each and every one of you who watches this video, I acknowledge you. I acknowledge your presence, and I will never forget it. When I experienced and struggled through extreme indifference and cynicism, I found it very difficult to appreciate and express deep, specifically negative emotions. Unlike with shallower and positive emotions, I saw no practical value in expressing negative emotions. Eventually, I not only lost the capability to express those emotions, but I also lost the capability to feel them. After lightly touching on the subject of crying with some of my friends recently to, unbeknownst to them, take a sort of survey, I've heard a lot of them mention that they hadn't cried in a long time either. However, their reasons far differed from mine. It is not as if they couldn't feel those emotions, they simply chose not to express them. There seems to be some form of a negative stigma attached to the act of crying. My minimal experience with crying has been overall positive, but a lot of people see it as an embarrassing thing. I'm proud to say that I can cry without the burden of feeling shameful. Crying is not a burden. It is not an inherently bad thing, and it shouldn't feel embarrassing. Showing your weakness in tears serves as a reminder of your humanity, not just for yourself, but for others too. Not being able to cry felt like an inability to feel pain altogether. And as I stated in my Why We Need Pain essay, losing your sense of pain would be worse than feeling all of the pain in the world all at once. It's an isolating feeling, one that can't be shaken off or ignored. Learning to cry was the biggest hurdle in overcoming most of my indifference. After all, I became self-aware that my indifference was a problem once I noticed my inability to cry. It was a long and arduous process to get to where I am now, and it all started with one auto memory doll and her quest to find the meaning of the words, I love you. In my first essay, I mentioned that the National Catholic Youth Conference was the first time I had cried in years. That was one of the moments in my life where I decided to start working on overcoming my indifference. I cried there, but it wasn't entirely natural. I could feel the urge to cry, but my conscience kept saying to me, what's the point? It'll only be a burden. I forced myself to shed the first tear, and the rest followed on their own. It was a truly wonderful feeling, crying tears of joy. I was crying, but I was also smiling. I was happy to finally be able to cry, even if the natural tears followed the forced ones. It represented progress, and that was enough for me. The first time I watched Violet Evergarden, I didn't feel anything. I loved the show and the characters, sure, but I didn't feel any empathy or any emotions attached to the show. At the time, the only emotion I had felt toward any anime was mild nostalgia towards some shows I had watched years before. Still, Violet Evergarden was the reason I started watching anime again after several years of falling out of it. It was a refreshing break from the horrible tropes that plagued my generalizations of the medium. On a whim, I decided to give the series a rewatch during the quarantine. Up until that point, I had only been making gradual progress at reconnecting with my emotions. There was a fairly large time gap between when I had watched the series for the first time and my first rewatch, so I'd forgotten a lot of what actually happened in the series. I binged the entire series in one night. Through the first arc, I became completely re-immersed into the series. I'd forgotten how great the world building, animation, story, and characters all were. Then, episode 3 came around. At the end of the episode, I knew exactly what would happen, yet I still managed to tear up. I didn't even realize I was tearing up until I couldn't see the screen anymore. It was amazing. After only 3 episodes, I had cried completely naturally without even thinking about it or even realizing I was crying. In episode 7, Violet realized that she was burning. All her life, she had lived without paying mind to her emotions or the impact of her actions. She had killed dozens of people throughout the war without a second thought. She thought that she was an emotionless and indifferent tool, a weapon used for war. But in reality, she had a fiery and passionate heart, burning ferociously with the powerful emotions she repressed deep within. In episode 9, she couldn't take the burden of her actions and attempted to kill herself. This scene made me cry more than any other scene before it. Just like Violet, I was burning. All this time, I had been indifferent and careless of sentiment. In this scene, I realized what I had done to my relationships. It wasn't just about me anymore. My screw-up had affected many people around me, too. I had pushed people away and treated them somewhat coldly, simply because I thought there was no point in getting attached to people. My indifference didn't cause my emotions to disappear. Emotions don't work like that. They were just suppressed deep within me. I wasn't an empty shell, I was simply oblivious to my burns. And just like Violet, I had many burns. Episode 10 is the most tragic episode of the show. I, having watched the show already, knew exactly how the episode ended. I teared up repeatedly throughout the entire episode because I knew what was going to happen. At the end of the episode, it's the first time Violet actually cries due to one of her clients. It was also the first time I had cried thoroughly without forcing the first tears. I cried and cried and cried, all the way through the end credits until my face felt completely numb. Then, I leaned back in my chair, gave a hefty sigh, and smiled. Now, I can safely say that crying comes naturally to me. I'm actually far more sensitive than I was before I even became completely indifferent. After rewatching Violet Evergarden for the first time, I found myself crying at even trivial things for the next several days. I remember dropping my phone once while alone in my room, and I cried. I couldn't help it. It was like my eyes were trying to make up for all the tears that I had held in for so long. I know a lot of people will suppress their crying because they find it embarrassing or inappropriate to shed tears, but I will always disagree. Don't feel shame in your tears. Feel pride in them. It's something we all have, and I'd say it's a gift we should all appreciate.